So how do we learn from virtual reality? I'm going to talk about how we learn from virtual reality first by talking about what 3D learning is, because 3D learning explains what's happening in our mind, what's happening when we learn from virtual reality. So basically 3D learning is a multi-sensory learning theory that expands on our prior, what I call 2D or two-dimensional learning theories such as dual coding, cognitive theory of multimedia learning, cognitive affective theory of multimedia learning, Badley and Hitch's theory. It expands on them by saying that we have more than those two channels in working memory. 3D learning really says that we have multiple, many different channels in working memory that we can work with that aren't necessarily, competing with each other, even though they're all competing for this limited space that we do have in working memory. So if you're more interested in learning more about 3D learning in general, check out some of my other links or videos on my website and such, because there are more there. But this is really, the point of what I'm discussing right now is to talk about how we learn from virtual reality using that as a framework or a model. All right, so we basically have these three types of memory. Sensory memory, which is where we get our first inputs, where we're going to sense something. We have working memory, which is where, we're forming our concepts, we're problem solving, we're doing everything, working with that long-term memory. And then we have long-term memory, which is where we store, this indefinite storage area. And some authors describe some of the different types of long-term memory we have. I'm not going to discuss those in this video. I'm keeping it at, just long-term memory. All right, so first, when we're learning from virtual reality, we have multiple inputs coming in, right? So we have our ears, where maybe we're listening to some sounds, some words. We have our eyes, where we're seeing our environment, right? We might be seeing text on the screen. We might be seeing in pictures. We're seeing our whole entire environment, everything that's happening. And then we have our hands. Our hands are our controls in virtual reality, right? And that can involve something like, like here is HTC's Vive controller. Oculus Rift has their own controller. Maybe we're using some kind of fancy glove. No, this is actually a Nintendo Power Glove from the 80s. But, there are gloves coming out that help us move. And there will eventually be sensors that'll be able to really pick us up without even having anything on us. And they'll pick up more than just our hands. They'll pick up our arms, legs, full suits. And, so we have these other sensory items, senses coming into the picture here. All right, so in working memory, in general, when we're learning from VR, and I'm just talking about three different channels we're using in our working memory as we're talking through how do we learn something in VR for the time being. But, this could be expanded significantly. So we have this verbal information, which is what we're hearing, what we're reading, the text, anything that's, going into that verbal processing channel. We have our visual, which is going to be our, everything we're seeing in the environment, everything that's happening. And then we have this kinesthetic, which is our movement, our hands. And we could add other channels in there as well. Like, there could be VR environments specifically if you're doing like medical VR. There could be smells, like they could be adding smells for like certain kinds of things, because, a doctor can smell something and know like what certain types of things are. Like, let's just say something can tell if it's like an infection based on a smell of something, or just there are different kinds of smells that can be important in that kind of training or that kind of environment. Or military, a certain kind of smell could indicate a gas or something like that. So we could add different channels, and each one of those, like smelling, would be its own channel. So would kinesthetic. It wouldn't just be dual. Those would be separate things that could happen simultaneously. All right, and then we would take that stuff from our long-term memory and, form our concepts, solve our problems. But the idea of how we learn from VR is that we're formulating all this stuff in working memory. So so the question is, prior theories have really just focused on this, dual coding, theory that, we can see and we can hear. Or like, we could read text and look at pictures, that verbal and visual, or verbal and nonverbal channels. But what, 3D learning kind of explains is that's not necessarily how we learn when we start adding more modalities. Things change a little bit when we start getting rid of just this basic computer-based instruction. When we take this into a real environment, that's not necessarily how we learn, because as I suggested, you might be, looking at your environment. A surgeon might be looking at their patient, and they might be listening to their patient and at the same time get a smell. because that's a separate channel. It's not competing for either of these, this visual or, verbal resource. It's its own separate channel in working memory, and it helps us formulate or solve the problem of what's happening. So how do we learn from VR? This is explaining exactly what's happening in our working memory. We're taking these multiple inputs, and it's okay to design that way and learn that way because they're not competing. Now, our working memory is limited, so we always have to make sure we're not doing too many things that our working memory fails, right? We're not inhibiting learning. But we know that, having our hands do something and our eyes doesn't necessarily, they don't compete for the same channel. And that would explain, how we learn really from doing any task. Virtual reality is just the example here, but I could apply this to playing a video game with a controller or doing anything. I did another video on how it applies to learning a song on the guitar, but anything like that. Thank you.